Okay, good morning. So this is going to be the first of the videos I'm going to make for this YouTube channel. And so it will not be polished, I promise you that. And the other thing I will promise you is that it's going to be it's as if you're sitting at my kitchen table, which I am right now. So why am I doing this? I just want to talk briefly about that. One of my favorite sayings is that all that's necessary for the triumph of evil is that good men do nothing. And that was said by Edmund Burke, the father of modern conservative theory. And I believe that we are at a point in our country's history, maybe in the history of our world, our civilization, where we can no longer do nothing. You can take out the words and switch them around, and Burke's axiom can give truth to many things. Take out the word, all that's necessary for the triumph of the ambitious is that the modest do nothing. All that's necessary for the triumph of the stupid is that the smart do nothing. I kind of think that that's where we are today with our government and our society. There's a word called kakistocracy, and it's a real word, and it starts with a K. Don't ask me to spell it. But it is ruled by the stupid or by the least capable. That's what happens when you have a society such as ours, where we have outsourced our thinking to the political and information classes. The concern I have there is that we are going to get to a point where we have, whether we know it or not, a totalitarian type state. And let me explain what I mean by that. When George Washington, there's a quote attributed to him, that cultivation of the public intellect is the surest defense against tyranny. I think that's such a true statement. And so when we talk about a totalitarian state, and this is, I don't think we teach this anymore. This is something I kind of had to learn a little bit on my own, through my own reading. Is a totalitarian state is where you have three government, basically society exists. There are three tiers to society. You have public society, which is the state, the government, the authority, okay? Authority being power plus legitimacy. You have the authority at the top. And then you have civil society in the middle. And then at the bottom, you have private society. That's the individual. So in a totalitarian state, civil society is either compressed, co-opted, subordinated, or whatever, to the point that there is nothing between the power and the individual. I worry that we are approaching that because civil society, those things, that buffer between power and the individual, is declining. And so my hope is that by doing these videos, that maybe this is my way to contribute and help fight back. It's time for people, most people I believe are in the center. Most people are moderate. When you hear people say you're either with me or against me, well, that right there is a logical fallacy. That's called a false dichotomy. There are very few things in life that are black and white, that you're either with me or against me. But yet that's the kind of society we're becoming. That's the kind of politics we are engendering. But most people, and I believe this because I go to DC, I travel a great deal sometimes, and I talk to people. The political class in our society is divided. The information classes in our society are divided. Media, in some extent, I'd say higher education is definitely polarized. But you have certain segments of our society now where they are all or nothing. And that's a false dichotomy. That is a logical fallacy. And we need to oppose that and fight it. And these videos are my way of doing that. So you have public, civil, and private societies. That is the basic structure of human existence. Now, what's causing things to happen as they do today? I want to talk briefly about three things. One is technology. Two, morality and institutions. And finally, this idea of private knowledge and how we act on private knowledge, individual knowledge, how we as individuals think and how we choose to act in the world. So technology always moves more quickly than society. It advances more quickly than our minds and our institutions, our structures, our religions, our morality, anything can move. So let me just think of some examples, and I'm just going to talk to you briefly about a few of them. Take the printing press. I think it was invented in the 1400s, like the latter half of the 1400s by Gutenberg. Before that, there was no such thing as widespread literacy. The amount of information available to average persons was limited. Only a few people could read and write. But because of the printing press, fast forward a few decades, that technology begins to play a part in such things as the Protestant Reformation, where you have pamphlets and treatises that can be promulgated to large segments of society. We have different translations of the Bible that are available in the vernacular of the population. So the authority, the powers that be, this religious power at that time specifically, which undergirded the political structures of the world, came under threat. And that's the Protestant Reformation. So you have such things as the printing press. Now we can fast forward a few more years. Let's say industrialization, steam power. Now you have factories. You have people leaving the farms to go work in the factories. You have people working long hours, and that eventually grows into such things as the 8-hour workday. But you also have mass urbanization. You have child labor. Much of how we understand modern labor theory comes from the experience of industrialization. Marxism grew out of the Industrial Revolution. Things such as the cotton gin. The cotton gin changed the economics of slavery in the United States. And because of that led to political unrest, which led to the Civil War. Fast forward a few more years. Let's say the development of nuclear weapons. That changed how we understand warfare. That changed how we understand the presidency. And I'm going to touch briefly on that as well. And if I don't, please make a comment and say, Ted, come back and talk about the presidency. So now we have the capacity to destroy the world in a matter of hours. And so how do we understand that? How do we approach matters of national security? What kind of apparatus do we build to maintain stability and security in the world? Computers, information technology, this proliferation. Back in the 1990s, there began a theory called the super-empowered individual. And it was this belief that you could have one individual who could successfully leverage technology and cause dramatic political change. And back in the 90s, when this was occurring, one of the first people to pop up and people began to say this is an example of this super-empowered individual was Osama bin Laden. So you think about bin Laden and his videos talking about worldwide jihad and inciting and developing Al-Qaeda. The Ayatollah Khomeini back in the 70s, when he was exiled to Najaf from Iran, as I understand it, the Iraqi ambassador to Iran made a comment like, what's one more mullah in Najaf? Well, what Khomeini did was he made cassette tapes. And those were then smuggled back into Iran, and he went from being, kind of just one of many Ayatollahs, one of many religious figures, clerics, to actually becoming the leader, the Ayatollah. and of course overthrowing the Shah, and negated all the Shah's conventional power, the Savak, the police, the army, the military. And so technology can empower ideas, and this can be good or bad. And that's where we are today, I think. We have, in our society, we have an information class. We have people who know how to harness technology, specifically communications technology and social media. And then they can feed information to people. They can feed their narratives and mobilize large segments of our society. But what the problem there is that you have at the top, once again, that's the power, the civil society, and then you have the individual. But in the center, the civil society is not doing its job. It cannot, synthesize and basically segregate the false narratives, the misinformation, the bad thinking, the illogic, the false dichotomies. You're with me or against me. It can't separate the stereotypes. People lack faith right there, and that's the danger. So let's fast forward to technology and talk a little bit about that. It will take time for our society to catch up to this and for our thinking to fully absorb the influence that social media have on us. And I specifically want to talk about just one example. Time magazine, a print magazine. It used to be a really strong, pretty reputable magazine. The Person of the Year, if you read it traditionally, has been, usually back in the 30s, 40s, 50s, whatever. These were people of science, people who were accomplished. This year, or I guess the last one, was the president-elect and the vice president-elect. And in full disclosure, I don't read Time magazine. I read The Economist. And I didn't read the Time magazine where it had the Vice President Biden and Vice President-elect Harris now. But in my opinion, as I understand, the Person of the Year makes a change for better or worse, or somebody of significance. It should have been George Floyd. And I'll tell you why it should have been George Floyd. An obscure man from Minnesota whose death was recorded. And think about the changes that have stemmed from that episode on a street corner in Minneapolis. Look how it's changed our country and our world. It mobilized Black Lives Matter. It's mobilized other groups opposed to, say, the left, groups opposed to the right. It's given a bellicosity to our politics that probably wasn't there before. Now, granted, COVID has definitely thrown everyone into the hot water, but I believe Mr. Floyd's death was the spark that has lit a lot of revolution and unrest in our country. But I would also highlight for you, ladies and gentlemen, that there is immense value in studying and understanding this event. One of the things I do is I'll read autopsy reports. And the autopsy report on Mr. Floyd is available. It's publicly available information. And it was released by the medical examiner's office in Minnesota. And what struck me about it as I read it was just the condition of his body. The fact that he had health issues. He had issues with his organs. He had probably had COVID-19. That he had probably used some types of illegal drugs. I mean, there were all these things in there about Mr. Floyd's body. And as I read that, I thought to myself that, this is a human being, a person made in the image and likeness of God, a person who has probably suffered his entire life. And yet, look at his body, look how it is. And this is a reality that large segments of our population, especially people within the minority community and the black community especially, this is their existence. This is their reality every day. One of poor nutrition, one of poor health, one of struggle. And there was a greater reality for me when I read that. And it's easy to get caught up in the graphic imagery of violence. But it's another thing to step back and see there's a bigger picture here. And I think that Mr. Floyd's death by itself, the impact that has had on everything, and it just everyone is touched by that. And I think that's why Time Magazine made such a terrible mistake in choosing Mr. Biden and Ms. Harris as their persons of the year, because I think Mr. Floyd deserved it much more richly. And so I say that because it also points out to me that we are looking to our political class for moral leadership. We are looking to our celebrity class, our information class, the academic world, and others for moral leadership. And that's an error. So I want to talk briefly about that, if I may, please. Rules of politics cannot be applied to rules of morality. In The Prince by Machiavelli, a great book, Machiavelli makes the statement that people, to the effect that people are enamored with political power because all can see but few can touch. And so people look at the presidency, they look at people on TV screens or people who are influencers, and they give them almost like a halo effect. They think that these are perfect people. These are people who have high morals and high standards, and they look beautiful, or they look like they have it together, therefore they must have it together, and I should listen to them and take my moral cues. I should maybe emulate them in some fashion. And that's a false thing right there. In some ways, I kind of think that we need to understand who these people really are. So take, for instance, actors, okay, people in Hollywood. Well, when you really drill down, actors are nothing more than professional liars. When you look at people in politics, well, quite often people in politics are enamored with power. And Lord Acton tells us that power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Anyone who wants power, the motivation for power should never be self-aggrandizement. It shouldn't be advancement of self. It should be to do better, to do something better for others. Servant leadership. And I don't think we have enough of those in government today. So I want to talk briefly about this and maybe give you a parallel to what I think is going on in the moral structures of our world. If you read the Bible, okay, and I'm not pushing religion, but there's a kind of an approach to understanding religion that's instructive here. So the Gospels in the Christian Bible, there are 4 of them: Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Scholars believe that sometime after the death of Jesus Christ, and for those of us who are Christians, we believe in the resurrection of Jesus Christ, there was a church that was established, there was this group, and then there were these traditions, and there were these oral traditions of Jesus. But at some point, there was something written down about Jesus. Jesus' teachings and his sayings and accounts of his life were written into this thing. I think they call it Q. And so Q formed the basis, the foundation of the 3 synoptic gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And if you read them, they're kind of similar to Jesus, tailored a little bit for specific audiences to stress certain facets of Jesus' life or teachings, to make them more germane to the audience they were intending to reach. But then you look at the Gospel of John, okay? And we say, John is the most theological of the Gospels because it's so different. But what is believed about John is that unlike the synoptic gospels where they took their guidance from this Q, they based a lot of their writings on that. The Gospel of John is where the early Christians projected and imposed on the character of Jesus their beliefs about Jesus. It's a different Jesus than what you see in Matthew, Mark, and Luke. That's what we're doing in our society today, ladies and gentlemen. We are imposing and projecting our moral hopes on people in political and entertainment and, say, celebrity life. And that's unfair for us to do that to them. I think people who are attracted to those fields are inherently kind of, I think, a little bit flawed maybe in some respects. But I think that we're imposing our hopes, aspirations, and just our desire for moral clarity and certainty on people in elected office, people who are in the entertainment industry. And that's unfair to do that. And also that's abrogating our responsibility. I mean, think about this, if I may. The presidency, during the campaign, we heard about it's about the character of our nation, the soul of our nation. The presidency was never designed to be a font of moral leadership and guidance. Okay, the president is not the Pope or the Dalai Lama or, a saint. I think that I personally, I don't want my people who can do the job to be altruistic. I don't think altruism is a good thing in leading a country sometimes. Sometimes we need people who can make really hard and morally murky decisions. But yet, for some reason, as a society, we seem to expect moral leadership from people who are high visibility. And we are going to always be disappointed when we do that. So, I want to talk briefly about kind of applying those things to the current state of affairs in the country today. I think what's going on with President Trump, this can be a very good thing for our society and our country. And I'll tell you why. When the Constitution was written, keep in mind it was written by men who had just a few years earlier, 1787, 1783 was the Treaty of Ghent, I believe. So 4 or 5 years prior, had successfully gained their independence from a king. They feared too much government. They feared a unitary executive. And so that's why our government, we have federalism. We have, you have local government, but you have state government, and then you have federal government. Federal government is one of enumerated powers. The federal government has only the power, and I would rather use the word authority because power, anybody can have power, but I expect government to have authority, which is power plus legitimacy. But the federal government has only the authorities given to it directly by the Constitution. Whereas state governments have unlimited authorities, and those are constrained by state constitutions and also by the Bill of Rights of the federal Constitution. So the Founding Fathers feared a unitary executive. And there were multiple proposals about should it be 3 people, should it be 1, whatever. The blessing we had was that we had, in the early days of our republic especially, we had some pretty remarkable leaders. We had men such as George Washington. He could have been king. He turned it down. And what did he do? He served 2 terms and he left. We have, in some ways, given these people, we've made secular saints of them. We've named buildings and bridges after them. We've put them on our currency. All good things. But they're not perfect people. They're not moral leaders. I mean, there's things we can take from their lives and say, yeah, that's moral. That's a value I want my children to emulate. I want to respect that, and I want to teach my children that that's a good example. But I don't want them defining my morals. I think there are other people and other institutions that do that, such as churches, or my own conscience. And so the presidency for many years was, just the chief executive of the United States government. The United States government was very small from up until the 20th century, really. In fact, in the 1920s, I think it was, I don't know if it was Coolidge or Harding, I think it may have been President Coolidge, who made the comment that the federal government could go out of business and nobody would notice. The federal government's impact in your life was so small. Now, after the Second World War, of course, actually during the Depression, we saw a massive expansion of the federal government because we had this modern, highly networked economy that needed to be restored. And so we had the New Deal and massive federal involvement in facets of our lives. And the Supreme Court, at that time, backed the Roosevelt administration up on many of these things and authorized the broad expansion of federal government power and influence. And so Depression ends, World War II begins, World War II ends, and now we're in a world where we have standing militaries and a standing arms industry and a standing security apparatus in our country. We developed the National Security Act of 1947. We established the intelligence community. The CIA, the Pentagon, all these other things. And I've spent much of my life in that field. And so please don't think this is one of those crazy, the government's out to get you. But no, I want to explain how those things have helped shape our reality today. And we also have things such as nuclear weapons. We have standing adversaries. We have the Soviet Union. The importance of the presidency expands dramatically. It's not just the chief executive of the United States. It is now the one person with the power to end human civilization. And also, we're in a moral contest with the Soviets. From the 1940s until, say, 1991, December of 1991, when the Soviet Union disintegrated, when it dissolved. And so we began to look to our government for moral leadership, to articulate our ideals in the world. And we began to talk more about the morality of the United States, human rights in the 1970s, civil rights in the 1960s. These things took on added significance after World War II. We looked for leaders who could articulate those values to the world. And those are good things, got it. But we can't act surprised when these people fall short now. And so, Depression, World War II, Cold War, the nuclear age, and then we move into the 1960s, where we see the federal government really kind of say, hey, you know what, we're going to become involved in matters of poverty and matters of race. And politics took on a moral dimension that became very dichotomized. I think in the 1960s is where you begin to see people actually begin to label the other side as evil. And I'm reminded of something Senator Dole said one time: you don't have enemies in this business, you have opponents. In the 1970s, you have Watergate. And so we see this, people are so disappointed that the chief executive of the United States was doing something crooked. And so, boom, we want moral leadership in the White House. Move on to 1970s. President Carter was elected because, I'm a born-again Christian. I'm a moral man. Well, he was, but he was probably in many ways also a very ineffective president. So, we've seen this desire to find moral guidance in the presidency. It was never designed to do that. It was simply to be the chief executive of the United States. We have looked for a certain level of maturity in the presidency, which I totally agree with. I think anybody who aspires to leadership should be mature. And we've concerned ourselves with, back in the past especially, the fact that we could face mutually assured destruction, nuclear annihilation on both sides of the Atlantic, if not the world. And so I think we always better scrutinized those who sought higher office. I don't think, and this is just my opinion now, I don't think people such as maybe some of the latest crop of people to be elected president could have been elected president during the Cold War. I think we would have had very severe doubts about their fitness and abilities to navigate the world. And I could be wrong, but I think we definitely scrutinized our leaders more when we faced the prospect of imminent destruction of our world. So I'm unsurprised that people are disappointed. That reality, though, also drove changes in our Constitution, and I want to talk briefly about that. So, in the United States, if I remember correctly, let me count the number of presidents we've had pass away in office. We've had Taylor, Lincoln, Garfield, McKinley, Harding, Roosevelt, Kennedy. That's 7 presidents die in office. A few were assassinated. You see Kennedy, McKinley, Garfield, Lincoln. In fact, there was an idea at one time that if you were elected in a year that ends with a 0, you were going to die in office. And so, if a president dies in office in the 1800s, well, that's a bad thing, but it's not the end of the world. I mean, this federal government's role is so small. The fact that by the time most people hear about it, it's been a day or two. The stock market's not going to crash. The Russians aren't going to launch their nuclear weapons at us or something like that. There won't be riots in the streets. Now, but during the Cold War, as these things happened, as these things advanced, well, when President Kennedy was assassinated, people knew about that pretty much in real time. You could watch it on television. One of the first concerns President Johnson, or then Vice President Johnson, had in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963, was that the death of President Kennedy, that the assassination was a precursor to a Soviet attack. That's one of the reasons he wanted to ensure that Air Force One left Dallas as soon as possible and got to Washington, D.C. So that episode, the assassination of President Kennedy in 1963, led to the 25th Amendment, which was formally ratified, I believe, by 38 states in 1965. It was actually introduced by Senator Birch Bayh, Evan Bayh's father. And it sets out procedures for the president to be replaced if the president becomes incapacitated. And the president can either, relieve himself of his duties as president by communicating to the President pro tem of the Senate and Speaker of the House that, hey, I'm ill or I can't do my job, so the vice president's going to be acting president. But it also establishes procedures where the vice president and the cabinet can set the president aside for a while, and the vice president becomes the acting president, and then by, I think, 2/3 votes of the Senate, the presidency can be transferred to the vice president. And so there's a thing called the Constitution Center, which is actually written on this, and I'll put that link in this video for everybody to watch or to read. And it explains the 25th Amendment. But the 25th Amendment was never established for a punitive purpose. It was not established to punish a president for, acting inappropriately or even acting in a criminal manner or maybe contrary to his oath. The way we do that is through the impeachment process. And so through impeachment and then removal by the Senate after a trial by the Senate in which 2/3 of the senators vote to remove the president. And so I'm concerned when we hear people invoke the 25th Amendment against President Trump, because I believe that, I don't want to politicize the very measures we look to ensure continuity and survival of our government and our way of life. The 25th Amendment was written and ratified to ensure that the government of the United States would survive the death of the President of the United States or his incapacitation. It was basically written to ensure this survival of the United States of America. The idea that we would politicize that it's disturbing to me. The less politicization of our government, the less politicization of our procedures, the better. And so I would highlight for everybody to take a chance and read the 25th Amendment and to read the background. And like I said, I'll put that link in the video here. But to also understand that, we think President Trump has 8 days left in office as of today. I'll give you my quick opinion about that, and then, like I said, feel free to disagree with me. But I will say this. I supported President Trump twice. I'm a Republican. I'm a conservative. I'm a conservative because I believe in the conservative approach to government. Do I agree with everything the Republican Party stands for? No. Do I agree with everything President Trump did? No. But on the whole, I favored him over President-elect Biden. Now, that being the case, I know that there's been a lot in the media, and specifically social media, much of which I have to wonder how much of this is true, but it's very inflammatory. It's very emotional. It catches you, and it strikes at the very heart. It strikes at ideas of justice and fairness about this being a rigged election. Now, I have a question for you, though. As I understand it, Dominion and others have threatened to sue certain people in President Trump's campaign, certain people representing President Trump, certain people who've made accusations against them that they, rigged the election machines and, helped rig this election. So, if those who believe that this was a rigged election truly believe this and have evidence to back up their claims, they were about to be afforded their day in court with subpoena power, where they can cross-examine and they can, get documents from Dominion and others, where they could force them to produce evidence, where it would be tested against hearsay. If they truly believe that this was a rigged election, why did they back off their claims when they were threatened with suit? I think they would welcome it. If I truly believed that Dominion and others were complicit, and I had an opportunity to state my case in open court, broadcast, televised, introduced into the public record, promulgated, commented on, I would take it. But instead, what did they do? They shut up. And so what you have unfounded accusations that are now have undermined the perceived integrity of this election. I don't like the outcome of the election. I'll be honest with you. But my loyalty is to the Constitution. I believe in the Constitution. And what I see now is I see that there are people who have, felt marginalized, and they have chosen to take matters into their own hands and to employ violence to get their way. Either the left or the right, neither the left nor the right in America has the right to impose its will on other Americans by coercion. I'll say that again. Neither the left nor the right in America has the authority or the power, or should have the power, to impose its will on the American people by force. I'm disappointed with the results of the election. I'm disappointed with President Trump. It happened on his watch. Whether he thinks he did it or not, his rhetoric inflamed a crowd that attacked the Capitol and led to the deaths of other Americans. There is nothing more sacred in this world to me, other than God himself, than the privilege of being an American. And to turn an American against another American to ensure the advancement of a political idea or political career or one's political advantage is, in my opinion, morally disqualifies anyone for higher office. And I mean that on both the left and the right. Their rhetoric has turned Americans against each other. We have outsourced our moral judgment to a class of people who are intellectually deficient and morally flawed. I hope that I've made some sense in this video. I'll make other videos if you ask me to. I'd be glad to do this. I found this rather cathartic, but I also find this, I think this is going to be my way of just fighting back. And so please feel free to leave comments. I apologize for rambling. It was the first one. I didn't have too many notes. I kind of made this on the fly. I'll be more polished in the future. But I welcome your feedback. And, feel free to disagree with me. There's nothing un-American about disagreeing with each other. There is something un-American about fighting each other. So thank you so much. God bless you, and God bless our country. Thank you.